Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to you all. Now, before we start, I know that you'll all be angered and in despair over events in Gaza, the West Bank, Palestine, and the region. We clearly have a lot of work to do and to up our game at Caabu and with partner organizations at a time when our government cannot even call out a blockade on a civilian occupation on a civilian population under occupation as a violation of international law, where bombing hospitals has become normalized, genocidal comments continue to be uttered and circulated. And as you would expect, we at Caabu have been hard at it. We had a briefing with MPs yesterday, meetings with Foreign Office ministers and officials, and more to come. And we've got a delegation of new MPs coming up next month. So please do keep up your letters to MPs. And I know many of you get very frustrated, and I understand why with the responses you get, but it does make a difference. So please do keep at it. And may I also take this opportunity to thank all of those of you who've so kindly donated to Caabu's Ramadan appeal. It really does make a difference, and it will enable us to expand our activities at a time when it's more needed than ever. Well, it's lovely to see so many of you this afternoon as we address what is a really important issue, both because of the actual rise in anti-Semitism that needs to be addressed robustly, but also because of its weaponization to stifle and shut down debate, to intimidate even. And let me be clear that at Caabu we have no truck with either, nor do we with anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian racism that is far less discussed, but sadly very present. So we have today a conversation between two brilliant speakers who I have so much respect for, and on this occasion particularly to Rachel Shabi, who has written this terrific book, Off-White, The Truth About Anti Semitism, one that needed to be written, in my view. And we're also really grateful to have the lovely Emily Hilton, the International Policy Director of Diaspora Alliance and a co-founder of NAMOD UK with us, who's kindly agreed to be in conversation with Rachel. I'm going to pass over to her now. They will address some of the themes of the book, and then we shall have a Q&A. And if we could have questions, not comments, in the chat as ever. And also, just to state the obvious, that let's try to have this debate and discussion in as respectful a fashion as possible. I know that it's an issue that sparks a lot of heated debate and discussion. So Em and Rachel, thank you very much for doing this. We look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. And we really hope this is a fruitful and interesting discussion for you. And Rachel, welcome. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you, particularly having spoken to you a lot during the process of writing the book, and having just reread it now in advance of this talk. I really feel like it is such an important text for us to be thinking about how to make sense of so many different moving parts of the crisis, I think, that we find ourselves in. But I guess to start us off, I think it would be really helpful for us to hear a bit about why you thought it was important to write this book, and what sort of inspired or motivated you to take on this complex and at times quite fraught subject.
Thanks so much, Em. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you about this, having been discussing this for some years. And I want to say a big thank you to Caabu for hosting this and just for metabolizing the idea of the book and the aims of the book and integrating it into the work that you do with such thought and care. And thanks to everybody who's joined this conversation today. So the first thing to say about writing the book is that I really didn't want to. When it wasn't really, anti-Semitism wasn't really my beat. It wasn't really something that I covered as a journalist. I've reported from Israel-Palestine. I've reported from other parts of the Middle East through the Arab uprisings. And then from the UK, and it sort of barged into my world rather than have me actively have it as a beat, as a field of expertise. And when I started talking about it with friends and an agent, which was early 22, I mean, friends also resisted it on my behalf. They would, I write in the book that they would look at me as if I just suggested I plan to jump into a vat of hazardous waste. As in, why would you want to write about such a fractious subject that basically involves a whole bunch of people yelling at each other and being obnoxious to each other, which is what the conversation has become. And that's precisely why I decided to write the book, because the way that this conversation is playing out, the way that our media and politics are navigating both anti-Semitism itself and its political uses, has created just this dumpster fire of a conversation where there's so much bad faith, misunderstanding, people yelling at each other. It causes more division between people who should otherwise be allied, and it causes less overall understanding of the subject of anti-Semitism itself. And so I wanted to approach all of that in its entirety from a progressive perspective and look at why this had come about, with the hope that if we understood why it had become such a garbage conversation, we could produce a better one collectively. So the book tries to pull apart various strands of why that has gone so wrong. There's a couple of chapters that look at the progressive left and why there's a challenge of seeing anti-Semitism alongside other forms of racism. There's a couple of chapters around both the way we talk about Israel and the way claims of anti-Semitism have been used by Israel to shut down advocacy for Palestine, and actually much more since. And there's a couple of chapters on the far right who are not just using anti-Semitism to mobilize themselves with things like great replacement theory, but also using a sort of proclaimed fight against anti-Semitism, a pretense of caring about Jewish people in order to rehabilitate their political fortunes and advance their own political ideology, which currently is migrant and Muslim bashing. So I wanted to look at every single bit of that picture, because it seems like all these things, while some of them contradict themselves, are actually contributing to this horrendous and divisive conversation about the subject that we're all currently mired in.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And I want to come back to the far right, because I think particularly that is something that can feel very confusing and almost sort of parallel universe kind of positioning that we find ourselves in. But I think because I imagine a lot of people here have come to this conversation because they are interested in how this relates to Israel-Palestine, the current brutal assault and genocide of destruction we see in Gaza. And I know that we've had a few conversations where we talk a little bit about how, we don't want to actually have to talk about anti-Semitism every time we're talking about human rights violations in Gaza or the West Bank, but often this comes up. These issues are intertwined, whether we like that or not. And a lot of the work that we do, both yourself obviously and work we do at DA, is about trying to untangle those things and untangle these different issues so we can have a better analysis. I was wondering if thinking about your chapter in the book, talking specifically about this, could you go into a bit more detail about why this happens? Why does the issue of anti-Semitism interrelate to Israel and Palestine, given the history, the current politics, and why therefore it's important for those of us who care about what's happening in Israel and Gaza and Palestine to address that and to address this issue effectively?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and you're absolutely right. And I really recommend the incredible work that Diaspora Alliance does in this sphere of trying to untangle all these elements. I mean, I think we can say what's true is that even though there's a lot of people yelling and turning this into a screaming match of bad faith and politicized claims of anti-Semitism, and misunderstandings over what anti-Semitism actually is. I think it's fair to say that, broadly speaking, most people who may be quiet about this, just for fear of entering a bun fight, most people actually do want to care about all these things together. Most people have equity and justice and anti-racism as mobilizing principles and things that they care deeply about, and want to find a way to apply those to all racialized minorities, and to the situation in Israel-Palestine, where we do get to advocate for Palestinians because of the horrendous violations and the ongoing oppression of Palestinian people, which now includes a war that genocide experts now describe as genocide. So I think that's an ongoing question of people, of how do we do all these things collectively and interrelatedly when it seems that claims of anti-Semitism are used to shut down our capacity to do some of those things, right? Claims of anti-Semitism have been used to silence criticism of Israel, and shut down the capacity for Palestinians to describe in their own words their own reality and their own experience of living under a brutal Israeli military occupation, and their experience of Israel from the start, which has been settler colonial. But at the same time, we can see that the way it's being used goes much wider. It goes beyond Israel, and it's now being used as a lever to shut down, it's been used to attack Black Lives Matter, diversity programs, critical race theory. In the US, we can see it's basically being used to attack education, to shut down liberal education institutions. It's against academic elites. So it's actually much wider than Israel-Palestine now, but we can see that the genesis of changing the definition of anti-Semitism to, well, it's an attack on Jewish people as a collective, as embodied by the state of Israel, is something that happened in the mid-70s, which I look at the origin story in the book. And we can see that it became more and more pronounced in the 2000s, primarily because Israel was facing more and more attacks, primarily because it was going through more and more violations and violence and abuses of international law and of Palestinians themselves. And then we saw it in overdrive, which I think when, many people who perhaps hadn't been following Israel-Palestine, but have been following Gaza, can see that it's being used for anything, for anybody who's criticizing Israel, whether it's the UN, whether it's the BBC is perceived to be anti-Semitic, The Guardian, British pop singers, and so what do we do in that environment where not only has it been used to this degree to silence critics of Israel, or just silence people crying out for the slaughter in Gaza to stop, and at the same time, we can see that anti-Semitism has spiraled globally. There has been a spike in anti-Semitic attacks, whether that's verbal or physical abuse or desecration of Jewish property, including synagogues. So that's our challenge of how do we do both those things at the same time?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, I think we are living through a very concerning moment in which, when you do have also a country alleging to do this work in the name of Jewish people, that is, of course, going to make us more vulnerable. And at the same time, we also need progressives and people who do claim to care or do want to care about anti-racism, about a more liberatory, equal society in the future, to have a better analysis than our opposition. Like, that's always why, we need to be better than them, especially because, without that they are using this issue very clearly to divide us. There has been a question in the chat about what's happening in the US around the Mahmoud Halil case and the sort of the attacks on universities. I don't know whether you want to bring that up now or speak to this now before we move into. I want to talk a bit about the far right, because I think this is very connected in terms of sort of who is using this issue to push a political agenda. But do you want to speak to that just now before we move on?
Well,
just about how this is attacking.
Yeah, the way that the Trump administration has gone after Mahmoud Khalil, who's a Palestinian green card holder, as well as since then other people who have been protesting Israel's assault on Gaza, is actually part of that picture of the far right using a pretend defense of Jewish people. And I guess, you know, it has been heartening to see a lot of Jewish organizations who I probably wouldn't agree with their position on Israel-Palestine, but they have in the US actually come out and said, absolutely not. This is a red line. Doesn't matter whether you agree with Mahmoud Khalil or not. This is absolutely an assault on democracy, and we should all resist it. You know, I think that's been heartening to see in a climate where this is claimed to be in defense of Jewish people. And more widely, that's what the far right has found. It's found this perfect strategy where it gets to rehabilitate its political fortunes, whether it's Trump and the far right in the US, whether it's Viktor Orban in Hungary, whether it's Marine Le Pen in France, whether it's Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. They are all using the same playbook, which is if we pretend to care a lot about Jewish people and be acting in defense of Jews, and if we do that by bear hugging Israel and bear hugging Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, we then get to rehabilitate our political fortunes. We, parties with Nazi roots and current practices of anti-Semitism, including Holocaust revisionism, we get to say, hey, we're not anti-Semitic. Look at this photograph of insert far-right leader hugging Netanyahu. How can we be anti-Semitic? And it's just this rehabilitation that allows them to advance their own political fortunes and advance their own political ideology, which happens to be Islamophobia and hating and scapegoating migrants. And so they get to pretend that this ideology of hating Muslims and migrants is done in the name of Jewish people and in a claimed defense of Jewish people. And it has been extraordinarily effective. It's a sort of sleight of hand that's been convincing insofar as it has allowed them to mobilize and advance politically and advance their own noxious and divisive political agenda.
Definitely. And I think just to say, we at Diaspora Alliance also put together a briefing note because it's important to know that these tactics around attacking education, attacking protest, the rights to protest, are used by far right and even to some extent center governments across Europe as well. We've seen this in the Netherlands. We've seen this in Germany in particular with Felix Klein, the non-Jewish anti-Semitism czar, saying he wants student encampments to be surveyed by the German security services. That, you know, calling for the destruction of a state should be considered a terrorist offense. We see this in Spain with police brutality, and obviously we've seen this in the UK too, with significant crackdowns on student protesters, on folks trying to talk about Palestine writ large. So it's important for, I think, that something again that me and Rachel have spoken about before is, you know, the international right are thinking internationally. You know, they are working together, they're trading tactics, and we need to be able to be thinking about that ourselves as well. But I think coming back to Israel in particular, which I think is significant around the fact that, you know, this week there is a conference in Jerusalem about combating anti-Semitism, and the majority of attendees or speakers are members of far-right political parties. And initially there were some others who were going to attend, the ADL, obviously, Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, the chief rabbi, Felix Klein, this anti-Semitism czar, but they decided to withdraw because of the presence of the far right. This conference has gone ahead, and I guess the question I'm asking is, one of the reasons I think that Israel and the far right do feel this kinship, and I've spoken about this, is because also Israel provides a blueprint in many ways for an ethno-nationalist state. Like, it does provide a way in which you know, there could be this partnership between some of the ideologies of what these far right politicians are doing and what the Israeli extremist government is trying to do. Do you have thoughts on that, or comment on whether that's the case?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And that far right conference in Israel, which I think Haaretz has been covering it. You did a great piece for Haaretz, is worth reading. And also the podcast this week is about that, because it actually just collapsed. It turned into a fiasco because of the number of Jewish figures in the diaspora who did not want to be associated with it. For them, that was the red line of we have our own communities in Europe to think about in the diaspora, and this doesn't really square with our remit there, which was reality kicking in, I think, in terms of where that diasporic support for Israel can lead, where it can end up. But I think it's absolutely true for Israel. The reason that this alliance developed in the first place was precisely to provide Israel with support across Europe at a time when criticism was growing across Europe. So in the early 2000s, Israel was coming under attack for things like the separation wall, which was declared illegal, and Israel went ahead and built it anyway, for the horrendous reoccupation and re-military occupation of Palestinian West Bank after the collapse of the peace talks and the Second Intifada, which was violent in Israel and resulted in suicide attacks in Israel. The response was horrendous from the Israeli army across West Bank cities. They were coming under attack for settlements expansion as well. And then we see throughout the 2000s, there's the siege of Gaza, and then several horrific bombardments of Gaza in which thousands of people were killed. And Israel is coming under fire at an EU level throughout that period. And so those alliances that it makes with a lot of Eastern European countries who are newly ascendant to the EU in the early 2000s is precisely to deflect from that. It's precisely to block any capacity for the EU to take political action. And that indeed was exactly what happened. So you can see that countries like Hungary consistently block any attempts of the EU to address things like settlements, the labeling of settlements goods, for instance, and up until this day, blocking whatever resolutions, however mealy-mouthed they may be, about Israel's assault on Gaza. So it's been effective from Israel's perspective. It has done what it's supposed to do. I think for those far-right authoritarian, I mean, they're essentially neo-fascistic parties. Absolutely, Israel is like the model of an ethno-nationalist state. But I think that honestly, there's a far wider issue for them. I don't think they're that concerned with Israel either way. I think what Israel enables, what that narrative enables, is for them to push this clash of civilizations narrative where they are the active protagonists defending everyone, whether it's Jews, whether it's women, whether it's children, because that's what fascists do, right? Against the marauding, mostly Muslim migrants. I think that's a far bigger story for them and a far bigger political mobilizer, actually, in terms of animating the far right and garnering support.
Yeah, definitely. I think that obviously, it's important for us to be able to understand the sort of different ways in like who is benefiting and what politics is this serving. And I think that, and I want to come to questions in a sec, but we have seen, I think, the significant upheaval we experienced post October 7th and the sort of real ushering in also of the ascendancy of so many of these far right political parties. We really are in a new thanks for muting. We really are sort of moving into a very frightening political reality in which these politics of the strongman politics, authoritarianism, anti-democracy, deep xenophobia and Islamophobia, rising anti-Semitism, rising racism writ large. And I guess the question which often comes up when we talk about these things, and it already came up in the chat, is sort of what do we do? Like, what can we do? And I very much appreciated in your book the ways in which you want this book to serve a purpose to support the left and progressives to really think about these issues, and to really think about how do we make sure that anti-Semitism, both real and also when it is instrumentalized, not disrupt the really crucial organizing and campaigning and advocacy we need to do to block the far right. But I guess more broadly, what do you think we as members of the public, the government, the international community, what should we be doing to try and put to better address this sort of political reality we find ourselves in?
Well, I think the first thing to do is just acknowledge that, you know, we in the UK are low information. There's just a widespread low information, low understanding of racism full stop, whether that's anti-Black racism, whether that's Islamophobia, whether that's anti-Semitism. There's very little joining of the dots between Britain and actually across Europe, colonial histories, and the origin stories of many racisms, anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, and actually anti-Semitism. And one of the things that I did, which I think provides the left with a frame in which to reconnect anti-Semitism to its wider struggle against all racism, is to understand the extent to which those are connected. They're not the same. If you are looking at anti-Semitism and thinking, well, I don't understand, that's not structural oppression, you won't find it by and large. You know, it doesn't operate in the same way. It's a different mechanism. But what happens when you look at the histories of these racisms is that you see the origin story is Christian Europe, Christian European rulers trying to find different ways to retain power by persecuting and demonizing different racialized minorities at different times and in different ways, but the outcome is always to maintain their own power. So you see the structures of anti-Semitism before it was even called anti-Semitism, before that we even had racism as a label in medieval Europe that was used to other and persecute and demonize Jewish people. That mechanism of purity of blood, you guys aren't pure, you don't have pure blood like Christian Europe's, that concept traveled across to the Americas, where it was used to justify racism, to create race and justify racism, which would justify colonialism and the horrific enslavement and torture of people that lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years, of Black people. And then you can see the parallels, it jumps back and forth again. So you can see Hitler, when he was looking at trying to find mechanisms to persecute Jewish people, looked to Jim Crow laws in the US, which were a way of maintaining white supremacy post when enslavement had ended. He looked to those laws and thought, can I use them? Because America is supposedly still a democracy, but is still racist, and I want to do that, right? So he ended up using something quite different, but you can see how racists are always cribbing notes from other racists. And the mechanisms used to persecute and demonize and racialize minorities are by and large the same. So once we have that understanding, I think we'll be better able to reconnect anti-Semitism to fighting that, to our joint struggle of fighting other racisms. There's no point fighting these things in silos. And I think one of the other things that we can do is, actually, the only people talking about tackling anti-Semitism at the moment are the far right, and all their solutions are horrendous. All their solutions are lock people up, shut down protests, shut down free speech, blame Muslims, blame migrants. They're all horrendous. Progressives are much more engaged in defending themselves against political claims of anti-Semitism, which absolutely needs to happen because those political claims are horrendous and have real life consequences in loss of jobs and livelihoods and reputations and education. And in the US now we're seeing residents, but we're not actually talking about what the solutions are. We don't have ones that are practical and commensurate with the right-wing ones, but obviously better. So that's something to think about as well.
Thank you, Rachel. I want to come to some of the questions in the chat, but just wanted to check, Joseph and Chris, how would you like us to do this Q&A part? Would you like us to just read out the questions in the chat, or do you want people to ask?
By all means, call people to ask the questions, that'd be fine if they're willing. If they don't want to ask, we can read them out.
Okay, great. I think there's a question here from Isabella Wise Gonzalez. Would you like to read your question out, or would you like to raise it?
Sorry, hi, can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, it was basically because Rachel, it's nice to meet you. I actually listened to a podcast with the London Review of Books recently, and you had mentioned how, roughly you mentioned a little bit how historically what anti-Semitism meant before and now we see a big difference, and also in regards to especially how it's been politicized now, whereby before yeah, just roughly, could you talk about how much it's evolved, especially now with current affairs, and how people may not know really its origins, let alone like what, yeah, so basically about that.
Should I answer each question?
Yeah. I think that, yeah, basically about the sort of changing definitions of anti-Semitism.
Hi, Isabella. It's nice to meet you, and thanks for the question. It's a really good one. So the definition of anti-Semitism, I think, is the same. However, it has been politicized into meaning something quite different. So anti-Semitism is a conspiracy about power. It's hatred of Jewish people as Jewish people. And it's premised on a conspiracy about power. So this is the actually powerful in Christian Europe. It has some of its origin in the UK, were devising a mechanism where Jewish people sections of the Jewish communities were given just enough power and status to be elevated as a minority that could then be a buffer, that could then be a punch bag. So if there was ever any unrest or, economic or political discontent, it could be directed at Jewish people. And we see that mechanism happen. There are various instances in medieval British history where you can actually trace that mechanism in attacks on, including killings of Jewish people. So that's the mechanism, and that has been consistent throughout. And I think, there's no such thing as left-wing or right-wing anti-Semitism. There's just anti-Semitism, but there are portals for it. There are ways that it shows up. So when we look at the far right, one of the main reasons it shows up, one of the main mechanisms is Great Replacement theory, which is the idea that Jewish people are undermining majority white Western nations by flooding them, by plotting to flood them with mostly Black and brown migrants. So this is all some Jewish plot, conspiracy. And it's something that, giant chunks of the public, 30% in the UK, more in France, more in the US, believe, and actually has real life violent outcomes with attacks. There was an attack on the synagogue in which people were killed in the US. Christchurch, New Zealand, where Muslims were killed at a mosque, a horrendous attack, attacks on Hispanic communities in the US and in African-American neighborhoods. So it has real life violent consequences, and it is rapidly mobilizing the far right. When it shows up in the left, it's usually about that conspiracy of power. And so when you look at the last 16, 17 months, I think it's, people will quite reasonably think, well, hang on a minute, why does Israel get to do this, right? Why does Israel get to enact this horrendous violence against Palestinian people? And why is it that even the US president, Joe Biden, is saying, well, I tried to stop it, but I couldn't, right? And so that in itself is a construct to lending itself about conspiracies. To be clear, Israel is the client state of the US. The other way around, but you can see the patterns of a conspiracy about power manifest across social media and sometimes in real life around questions to do with Israel-Palestine. So it has different entry points across the political spectrum. But what's happened, and I go into the reasons why in my book, in the mid-70s, Israel changed its appraisal. Prior to the mid-70s, the idea was that, you'd hear Theodor Herzl, for instance, is like considered one of the ideological founders of Zionism, would say, well, anti-Semitism will stop when there is an Israel, because, if Jews can be regular folk with a regular state, then there'll be no reason for anti-Semitism. That was the Zionist appraisal. it changed in the mid-70s to be, oh, anti-Semitism has morphed. It is morphed into attacks on the state of Israel. When we see attacks on the state of Israel or attacks on Zionism, that in itself is anti-Semitic. And unfortunately, because so much of the diaspora, so many diaspora Jewish people are growing up in an environment where, especially post-67, affiliation with Israel is complete. It's bound up to the extent that, and obviously this is changing for many people, but it's bound up to the extent that Jewishness is seen as intertwined with Israel. And Jewish communal bodies from the US, from the UK, across Europe, became part of the organizational push within Israel, politicians, think tanks, etc., to make that conflation, so that criticism of Israel and criticism of Zionism was itself constructed as anti-Semitism. And that's the challenge that we're dealing with today, with that conflation, which of course completely ignores the other people in that conversation, Palestinians who need to have their own way to describe their own experiences of Israel and Zionism without being accused of anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Rachel. Sorry, I was just reading a question in the chat. Yeah, I think there's been a couple of questions that I think would be helpful for us to talk about a bit more historically as well around, I think language can be very difficult in these times around, there's a question in the chat, for example, about the word Semite and anti-Semitism and how that sort of that language sort of came to be sort of describing Jews. And obviously, you know, I wonder if you have thoughts or want to talk a bit about the history of that, because obviously it's we know that this was a European phenomenon to sort of start talking about anti-Semitism as in relation to Jews. And I think that's like a very useful tidbit to sort of look at how so much of these issues lie at the feet of European racism. So do you want to just speak to a little bit about that? And then I guess the second question that I think comes up a lot, particularly around sort of how do we understand or assess the extent of anti-Semitism or the extent of anti-Jewish racism at this time? And why is it actually important that we recognize that this is something that is still a really virulent part of our society that we need to be addressing? How do we make sure that we can accept or understand that anti-Semitism is here without creating or constructing a hierarchy of prejudice, hierarchy of racism, hierarchy of bigotry? So there's sort of two parts to that.
Yeah. So is it Dalal who asked the question about?
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. It's a great one. It's the subject of a forthcoming piece about this precise thing, because it comes up so much. I think there's two ways of understanding this. Firstly, you're absolutely right that Semite is a construct, it's an Orientalist construct. It was a label created by Europe, by Europeans, to essentially define populations of the Middle East, including, you know, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish populations. So Semite was like a catch-all, and it was, of course, it was steeped in inferiority. It was an insult. It was, you are less people. And so that was what it was understood to be, right? It was, you know, Orientalism 101, essentially. Anti-Semitism is not a part of that trajectory. It's a label that was created by, it was coined by an actual anti-Semite, a German.
Yeah.
Who invented that label to specifically mean hatred of Jewish people. When we're talking about anti-Semitism, we're specifically talking about Jewish people. We're not talking about Semitic people. However, I personally think there is a conversation to be had about reconnecting all Semitic people and using that as a way of rejecting all Christian European racism, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's Islamophobia, whether it's anti-Black racism, as a sort of pushback of, oh, you think we're Semitic? Fine, we're Semitic. We're a Semitic collective that rejects outright your assumptions and your racializing categories. I think that is a discussion, but it's not the same discussion as the one about anti-Semitism, which refers specifically and only to Jewish people.
And it's important to note that the person this German person who created this phrase was about sort of showing pride in their hatred for Jewish people. It was like, you're proudly an anti-Semite or proudly anti-Semitic. And that's also part of this, I think, in terms of acknowledging the ways in which sort of European racism really does sort of stem from this inferiority, or this belief in the inferiority of other people. And yeah, again, so now to talk a bit about the sort of question of how we assess anti-Semitism, how we understand the extent of it, I think would be great if you.
Yeah, so this is a question that comes up a lot. And I think that part of the reason it comes up is because, you know, we are primed to understand racism as a black-white issue, as, you know, a structure, a systemic discrimination that is essentially comes from the racism created by colonialism and the enslavement of people, and which has continued to this day in structures of oppression. And we see those outcomes across, you know, health, education, the workplace, policing. And so when we look at that, when we look at the structural racism that Black and brown people experience to this day, there are caveats. There are ways in which Jewish people are discriminated against within those frameworks. And it's also important to say that there are Black Jewish people, brown Jewish people, Jews from the Middle East don't often show up looking like me. Most extended members of my family do not pass as white. But those people, by and large, do not experience, they don't have institutions of the state discriminating against them, producing lower outcomes across all aspects of life. And so for a lot of people, they think, well, why should I care then? You know, if it's not structurally affecting Jewish people. So the first thing to say is that the outcomes are in abuse. So the figures around monitoring of anti-Semitism, and this is across the board, this is from, you know, it's not just from organizations that are using definitions that conflate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. This is from the Met. This is from large-scale surveys that all show up that the figures are in verbal and physical abuse of Jewish people. And that's something that's how the discrimination is manifesting. So when I was researching the book, a whole bunch of people, Jewish people I interviewed, who show up as white, would say, yeah, we're white. We understand we're not experiencing structural discrimination. And then there'd be a but. And then there'd be a story of the anti-Semitism they experienced at school, or just the other week, or in the workplace, or in the housing market. So it is, as it turns out, a live subject that still operates today. And the reason it does that is the reason that any racism still percolates in society, which is that it's embedded in our society. It's hundreds of years old. It's in the structures of the way that we think about things, and it gets animated in moments of crisis. And the reason we should care about it is that it is destabilizing us. It's a misdirection of power. It's allowing the powerful to use both anti-Semitism itself and a claimed fight against it to distract us, to divide us, to weaken us. You know, and you can see that across the board. You can see that across the Western world, where, you know, we keep falling down because of this subject, because we haven't been able to mount a defense, not to stop the attacks coming, because the attacks will never stop coming, but to mobilize a wider, inclusive tent that can push back against it. So I think it's important to engage in fighting anti-Semitism in the same way that I think it's important we fight against authoritarianism and for an inclusive democracy.
Thanks, Rachel. There's a few different messages in the chat. I would like us to talk. Okay, so there's a few different conversations here about the US, and one of them is about Trump and why there isn't a sense of why Trump's anti-Semitism isn't called out more frequently. I'm not sure about who, but I think that's an interesting conversation around why this conversation around anti-Semitism and Trump maybe isn't as prominent as with other political figures. And then the second conversation is the second question was about the Israel lobby and the term and the use of the term Israel lobby, and how whether this is something that how we talk about the fact that there is a very clear advocacy strategy by pro-Israel organizations to influence policy, and how we sort of push acknowledge that within the context in which that's accused as inherently anti-Semitic versus sometimes it is anti-Semitic when people talk about this. So how would you make sense of that or help others make sense of having to talk about that issue?
Yeah, these are great questions. I mean, the Israel lobby one, I think the first thing to say is just it's one of the things that we have to do is engage in these conversations without all the bad faith of our mainstream political media conversation, which is just so distortive and so full of attacks against different elements of the progressive community, and make it impossible to actually have this conversation in good faith. So there is something about, you know, people just showing up and being part of this conversation in good faith is really important. Of course, there's an Israel lobby. Of course there is. Like other lobbies, it lobbies. The Israel lobby lobbies very effectively. It is very good at what it does. And it is no different from other lobbies in that. And especially in the US, it is no different from other lobbies in the way it's able to mobilize and influence politics. So I think the important piece to remember there is that our argument is with lobbies. Our argument is with the political abuse of democracies by lobbies being able to lobby in the first place. It's so undemocratic and antithetical to a democracy that you can buy political influence with lobbying, whether you're an oil lobby or the Israel lobby or a farmer lobby or the gun lobby, it's all the same, right? The objection is the same. I think where we get confused is the idea that that lobby is directing American foreign policy or British foreign policy. And you and I might disagree with the calculations made by establishment foreign policy, but there is a configuration that Israel is considered useful in that calculation, whether that's a strategic foothold in the Middle East, whether that's because of the military-industrial complex, which is very lucrative for a lot of arms firms in the US, in the UK, in Germany, whether it's security and intel sharing. Across multiple fronts, Israel is seen as a useful client state. And that is why it garners Western support. It doesn't garner Western support because AIPAC is a particularly belligerent lobby, right? And so I think sometimes we get that turned upside down, that the client state here is Israel. The useful client state is Israel, not America. The minute it is perceived to be less useful, and by the way, lots of foreign policy experts will say about Israel, hey, this is actively undermining American interests, right? Something that I would agree with. But as long as that perception is of usefulness, it's going to carry on being supported, regardless of lobbying.
Great, thank you. And what about Trump? What about the ways in which we think about, you know, I think a lot of the things we hear is like, Trump's good for the Jews or Trump's good for Israel. That's why we should support. I mean, these are the kinds of things that come up. How should we understand a figure like Donald Trump in relation to both the fact that you do see some organizations, very public Jewish organizations, talking positively or not calling out his anti-Semitism versus the very clear sort of far right alliance and sort of leadership that he's showing at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to state categorically that there is an abject moral failure of leading Jewish organizations, when you look at the US, when you look at AIPAC, when you look at the ADL and their full-throated support for Trump, there's just an abject moral failure in that political alignment. And it's clear that whether those groups decide to speak about anti-Semitism and calls it out depends very much on who is saying it. And if you're pro-Israel or, you know, operate like Trump, you can be as anti-Semitic as you like, as long as you have the right policy calibrations around Israel. So we have to call that out and keep calling that out, because it is just a failure, an epic failure in moral leadership and in ethical leadership and everything else. I think what's interesting about Trump and the sort of far-right team Trump that is behind him, behind the Trump administration, is just how anti-Semitic it is, right? And it's what's particularly troubling. I mean, it's not just the Nazi salutes, and it's not just like Musk making X, Twitter, a playground for the far right and all the noxious racism that has erupted on X because of that, including anti-Semitism. But it's also the way that they have turned being Jewish into like an ideology, right? So we got a foreshadowing of this a few years ago, where we had like Rudy Giuliani, the former Trump attorney. He was talking about the billionaire philanthropist George Soros, and he said, Giuliani, a Roman Catholic, said, well, I'm more Jewish than he is. He's not really Jewish, right? And you like, fast forward a few years and you get Trump saying of Chuck Schumer, the Democrat, well, he's not really Jewish. He's more a Palestinian, thereby managing to insult both Jewish people and Palestinians by suggesting that being Palestinian is somehow a slur. And it's like, oh, so now you've turned being Jewish. It's not a racialized minority. It's not an identity category. It's an ideology. It's an ideological alignment with Israel. And if you're not ideologically aligned with Israel, you're no longer Jewish. So I think that development from the far right is something that, again, we need to challenge outright. And I think one of the things that they try to do in the US, in the UK, is marginalize Jewish people who do not agree with that. And the reality is that you look at the polling in the UK, you look at the polling in the US around support for Israel, around definitions of anti-Semitism. We're not dealing with Jewish people who disagree with the way things are going, who disagree with the horrors of the war on Gaza. That's not a minority. That's not a fringe. It may be portrayed as such, but the polling simply does not bear that out. It is a political constituency that is currently not being represented, not by its own Jewish communal bodies, but actually not in the way that the mainstream media conversation is conducted either.
Well, I think that's a really great note to end on. Thank you so much, Rachel. Before I pass you back to Chris and Joe, I really always appreciate the insights you have on this subject. And I would really strongly recommend folks buy Rachel's book. It is not only a very incredibly useful source, it's just so excellently written. And I just really appreciate everything that you bring to this work, Rachel. And it's so great to be in struggle with you. So thank you. And I'll pass back to Joe and Chris.
Thank you very much, and thank you both of you for a really rich discussion. I think the manner in which you dissected this issue in so many of its different guises is something that is inspiring. I think that it offers a lot of food for thought, and I heartily agree with them that actually please do buy Rachel's book. Joe has put up the link to get it from independent bookshops. I think that would be very worthwhile. I'm sorry we couldn't get everybody's questions in on time, but I'm sure there'll be plenty of debates on this with Caabu, with other organizations as well, on different aspects of it all. So a huge thanks to both of you, to everybody who put in the questions, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.